There is a category of information in the United States government that most elected officials are never allowed to see. It's not classified because it's irrelevant to them. It's classified because someone decided they shouldn't have it. And in Washington, that decision, the decision about who gets access and when, is often where real power lives. Congress writes the laws. The president executes them. But intelligence? Intelligence flows through a different system. A system built on classification levels, security clearances, and a chain of command that runs not to Capitol Hill, but to the White House. And recently, that system was at the center of a significant dispute. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, produced a sensitive classified assessment, a formal intelligence product. The kind of document that, under established law and long-standing practice, is supposed to be shared with key members of Congress. Specifically with the Gang of Eight, the bipartisan group of senior congressional leaders who are legally entitled to receive the most sensitive intelligence findings the government produces. But they didn't get it. Not immediately. Not in the way the law envisions. What followed was a public dispute over access, delayed briefings, competing claims about legal obligation, and a quiet but serious question that cuts much deeper than the document itself. When the executive branch controls what Congress can know, who is really overseeing American intelligence? In this video, we're going to break down what happened, who gained leverage from it, and why this particular dispute, even if it fades from the headlines, marks a meaningful shift in how power moves between the branches of government. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created after September 11th, when investigations found that intelligence agencies weren't sharing information with each other. Congress built the DNI to sit above the agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, and coordinate them under one structure. The DNI serves the president, but the DNI also has legally mandated obligations to Congress. The National Security Act, the Intelligence Authorization Acts, and decades of congressional oversight rules establish that certain members of Congress must be kept fully and currently informed of significant intelligence activities. That phrase, fully and currently informed, is the legal standard. It's not a courtesy, it's statute. The Gang of Eight are the 8 senior congressional leaders who receive the most sensitive briefings, the top 4 leaders of both chambers, plus the chairs and ranking members of both intelligence committees. They're supposed to be read in even when the information can't be shared more broadly. So when a significant classified assessment was produced by the DNI, and those briefings were delayed when members of the Gang of Eight were not informed in the time frame the law and precedent require, it created an immediate legal and institutional confrontation. This is where the deeper shift begins. Because the dispute wasn't just about one document, it was about who has the authority to decide when Congress gets to know what the executive branch knows, and whether that authority has been quietly reshaping itself. The executive branch's argument, in situations like this, generally comes down to one core claim: the president controls classified information. The Constitution makes the president commander-in-chief. Courts have generally deferred to executive authority on matters of national security. And under that logic, the timing and scope of congressional briefings is ultimately a judgment call made by the executive. That argument has genuine legal weight. It's not invented. Courts have been reluctant for decades to wade into disputes between the branches over classified information. They tend to call these political questions, meaning questions that the judiciary considers best left to the political branches to resolve themselves. But here's what that deference actually produces in practice. If the courts won't intervene, and the executive controls the flow of information, then Congress's ability to exercise oversight depends almost entirely on executive cooperation. And when that cooperation is withheld or delayed, Congress has very few tools to compel access without escalating into a broader constitutional confrontation. The Gang of Eight briefing system exists precisely because of this problem. It was designed as a compromise, a narrow channel through which the most sensitive intelligence could be shared with at least some elected representatives without requiring broad disclosure. The idea was that Congress would be informed even when the information couldn't be widely distributed. But that system only functions if the executive branch treats its briefing obligations as mandatory rather than discretionary. From a constitutional standpoint, this may matter more than it first appears. What's actually being contested here is the operational meaning of oversight. The word appears throughout the Constitution and in congressional statutes, but oversight requires information. An oversight body that can't access the information it needs to evaluate isn't functioning as a check, it's functioning as a formality. When briefings are delayed, that's not just a procedural inconvenience. It's a structural question about whether Congress retains meaningful authority over the intelligence community, or whether it retains only the appearance of that authority. The separation of powers framework was built on one core assumption, that each branch would be capable of checking the others. Ambition must counteract ambition. But that logic only holds when each branch has access to the same basic facts. It strains when one branch controls what the others can know. Intelligence classification is a genuine national security necessity. Nobody serious argues that the CIA should hold public briefings on its sources and methods. The secrecy is real, and the rationale is legitimate. But classification also creates an asymmetry of information between the branches, and asymmetries of information over time tend to become asymmetries of power. That's exactly where the system starts to strain. This tension is not new. Every major intelligence oversight crisis in American history, from the surveillance abuses of the 1970s to the covert operations of the 1980s to the post-9/11 surveillance programs, revealed the .com, the same gap. What the executive branch knew and what Congress was told were often two different things. The dispute over this DNI assessment is a smaller event than any of those, but it reflects the same underlying dynamic. The real shift is not about the document itself. It's about what the handling of that document reveals about how the executive branch currently understands its obligations to Congress. If the default posture is to delay, to question the scope of mandatory briefings, to treat the Gang of Eight as a discretionary audience rather than a legally entitled one, that posture accumulates into something larger than any single incident. Congress does have tools to respond, and it's worth being clear-eyed about what those tools are and what they aren't. Appropriations power is the strongest lever. Congress funds the intelligence community, and through annual authorization bills, it can tighten briefing requirements, add mandatory timelines, and build in enforcement with real teeth. The problem is enforcement. When there's a dispute over whether a briefing obligation was satisfied, Congress can hold hearings, demand documents, subpoena witnesses. But those mechanisms are slow, politically costly, and depend on sustained institutional will, which is difficult to maintain in an era of deep partisan division. The intelligence committees face a structural disadvantage here. Their work is classified, their investigations are behind closed doors, and the public accountability that normally pressures executive compliance is muted precisely because the oversight is supposed to be secret. That's the bind. Courts have been reluctant to intervene in executive-legislative conflicts over classified information, but that reluctance is not absolute. If these disputes become more frequent, the question of whether federal courts will remain on the sidelines is genuinely open, but future administrations matter enormously. Every precedent that the current executive branch sets, every delayed briefing, every contested notification, every reinterpretation of what fully and currently informed requires, creates a template. Future administrations, regardless of party, will point to those precedents to justify their own conduct. That is how executive power typically expands, not through dramatic breaks, but through accumulated practices that harden into baseline expectations. If this pattern continues, if delayed briefings become routine, if the Gang of Eight system erodes from mandatory to advisory, the balance of authority over American intelligence could look very different in just a few years, not because any single law was repealed, but because the operational meaning of existing law was quietly renegotiated in favor of executive discretion. The history of intelligence oversight was never frictionless. There are legitimate arguments about operational security and the risks of disclosure, but those arguments don't resolve the core question. They intensify it. Democratic accountability over secret government activity requires that someone in the elected branch be able to know what that activity is. The Gang of Eight system is a narrow, imperfect mechanism, but it is the primary mechanism. If it functions only when the executive branch chooses to make it function, it is not a check, it is a courtesy. And in American constitutional design, the difference between a check and a courtesy is the difference between a system of balanced power and a system that appears balanced. We started with a simple question. Who decides what Congress can know? The formal answer is the law, statute, decades of oversight agreements. The practical answer is whoever controls the information. Right now, that's the executive branch. And what this dispute reveals without a decisive ruling, without a dramatic confrontation, is that the gap between those two answers may be widening. That won't dominate the headlines for long. These disputes rarely do. But shifts like this in access, in precedent, in the operational meaning of oversight quietly redefine how power moves in America. Not with an announcement, but with a precedent.